I signed the first ledger at 0400, and that made me complicit. They told me I was verifying steel and blessed iron, that my stamps would authorize war machines built from ore and faith. But the forge smelled wrong, and when the engineer recited the rite of initial assembly, he spoke names instead of serial codes. 4 of them, repeated 3 times each, like a prayer for the dead. My hand, 3rd grade scribe, munitorum tithe verification, assigned designation 7743 kappa, pressed the sanctified seal into warm wax pooled across the first ledger page. The crimson pooled around the Imperial aquila, then hardened. The wax smelled of tallow and something beneath it, something I had been trained not to name. Around me, Manufactory Bastion KX-17 groaned into wakefulness, a sound that traveled through deck plating and into bone. 12 hours, 1 shift, 417 armored units to be verified, blessed, sealed, and released to the crusade effort in the Hadran Reach. My duty was narrow: witness the process, confirm material compliance, authorize spiritual clearance. I was not an Enginseer. I was not a forge hand. I was the Imperium's assurance that what left this place was pure. The gantry beneath my boots vibrated as the primary forge altar ignited 3 levels below. I watched through reinforced glass, fogged at the edges from residual heat. Tech priests in rust-red robes moved in procession around a vast crucible, their mechadendrites trailing incense censers that left copper-green smoke in spiraling columns. The altar itself was a circular platform 20 meters across, ringed with carved litanies that glowed faintly when heated. At its center, the first hull waited raw, skeletal, already inscribed with purity seals I had approved in yesterday's preliminary audit. The Enginseer Dominus raised both arms, biological and augmetic, and began the rite of initial assembly. I expected the standard liturgy. I had heard it before during training rotations. The words should have been, by steel sanctified, by fire blessed, by the Omnissiah's will made manifest. But the Dominus spoke names instead. Corvin, Melissa, Trant, Davos. 4 names, spoken clearly, repeated 3 times each. The forge hands around the altar responded in unison, their voices merging into a single affirmation. My stylus hovered over the ledger. I had been instructed to record the opening prayer verbatim, but names were not serial codes. Names were not material designations. I glanced at the senior adept stationed beside me, a woman whose face was half obscured by a bronze rebreather. She did not react. Her eyes remained fixed on the altar below, unblinking, as if this were entirely routine. I wrote, "Rite of initial assembly commenced. Standard liturgy observed." The stamp had already been applied, the ledger was sealed, the shift had begun, and I was bound to see it through. The crucible ignited with a roar that turned the glass hot against my forehead. Molten alloy poured in controlled streams, guided by servo arms and graviton suspensors. The hull began to glow. I watched metal flow into joints, into preformed cavities, into spaces that would house engines, ammunition, crew. The light was white, then orange, then the deep red of cooling iron. The names were not repeated. The forge moved on. I turned the page and prepared for the next verification checkpoint. My education had been thorough. 3 years in the Schola Munitorum, specializing in resource verification and supply chain sanctity. I had been taught that the Imperium's survival depended on perfect obedience to doctrine, that inefficiency was a gateway to corruption, and that my role, however small, was essential. Tanks were not simply vehicles. They were faith incarnate, steel prayers answered by the machine god. They carried humanity's defiance into the teeth of Xenos horrors and heretic rebellions. To build them was holy labor. To verify them was sacred trust. I believed this. I had no reason not to. The manufactory was a city unto itself. 17 square kilometers of forges, assembly lines, consecration chambers, and loading bays. The air was perpetually thick with smoke and incense, a layered haze that made distant lights look like dying stars. Vox chants echoed through corridors wide enough to march entire companies through. Every surface bore inscriptions, litanies of function, warnings against techno-heresy, reminders that the Emperor's gaze rested upon all labor. The architecture was deliberate. High ceilings invoked humility. Narrow passages enforced discipline. The entire complex was designed to remind workers that they were components in a system far greater than themselves. I moved through my prescribed inspection route. First station, material intake verification. Cargo haulers arrived in synchronized intervals, each one loaded with raw resources from across the sector. Iron ore from mining worlds. Adamantium fragments salvaged from derelict warships. Promethium refined in orbital processing rigs. My task was to cross-reference manifests with physical cargo, ensure purity seals were intact, and confirm that nothing heretical had contaminated the supply chain. The work was repetitive but necessary. A single tainted component could corrupt an entire vehicle, turning it into a liability rather than an asset. The intake hall was cavernous, lit by amber lumen strips that flickered in rhythm with the forge's heartbeat. Hundreds of servitors moved in perfect unison, transferring crates from haulers to conveyor systems that fed deeper into the complex. I approached the first manifest terminal and began my audit. Serial codes scrolled across the screen, each one corresponding to a specific shipment. I scanned the first entry, adamantium plating, sourced from Naval Salvage Yard Theta 9. Purity confirmed. I applied my stylus to the data slate, authorizing release. The second entry made me pause. It was labeled Biological Surplus, Origin, Refugee Station Secundus 1-4. I had never seen that designation before. Biological surplus. The term was vague, clinical. I looked up, searching for a senior adept, but the nearest was 30 meters away, occupied with a servo arm recalibration. I returned my attention to the manifest. The shipment had already passed preliminary screening. Mechanicus approval codes were present. It had been rerouted through standard supply channels. Everything appeared correct, but the language felt wrong. Biological surplus. What did that mean? I made a notation in my audit log and continued. The next 17 entries were standard: plasteel, ceramite, lubricants, sacred oils. I applied my seals methodically, each one a small ritual of approval. The discomfort faded beneath the rhythm of routine. I was trained to trust the system. If the Mechanicus had approved the shipment, it was sanctified. My role was verification, not interpretation. The scent reached me halfway through the audit. Faint but distinct organic decay masked by chemical preservatives. It came from the direction of the newly arrived cargo haulers. I turned, following the smell, and saw servitors unloading sealed containers marked with biohazard glyphs. The containers were cylindrical, roughly 2 meters tall, and frost clung to their surfaces despite the forge's oppressive heat. A tech priest approached, accompanied by 2 armed Skitarii. I recognized him by his rank insignia, Enginseer Primus Valdric, assigned to material sanctification protocols. "Scribe," he said, his voice a blend of organic and synthetic tones. "Your audit is required." I stepped forward, data slate ready. "Enginseer Primus, I have questions regarding shipment entry 73. The designation is correct," he interrupted. His mechadendrites coiled tighter, a gesture I had learned indicated impatience. Biological surplus is a standard euphemism for organic reclamation. The Imperium wastes nothing, scribe. Tissue, bone, neural matter, all can be repurposed. The refugees who expired in transit are granted final service to the Emperor through material integration. This is efficiency. This is righteousness. I looked at the containers. Frost, preservation, neural matter. "I need to record this accurately," I said, keeping my voice steady, "for compliance purposes." "Then record it as approved," Valdric replied. The Mechanicus has already performed the necessary rites. Your task is to confirm receipt and authorize integration. Nothing more. I wanted to ask what integration meant. I wanted to understand why refugees people were being processed as raw material, but Valdric's posture made it clear that further questions were not welcome. The Skitari had not moved, but their presence felt heavier. I looked down at my data slate. The approval code was already pre-populated, waiting only for my authorization. I applied my seal. Valdric nodded once and turned away. The servitors resumed unloading. The containers were transferred onto conveyor belts and disappeared into the manufactory's depths. I returned to my station and continued the audit. My hand trembled slightly as I worked, so I gripped the stylus tighter. Efficiency. Righteousness. The words repeated in my mind, a catechism against discomfort. The Imperium's resources were finite. Every loss had to be reclaimed. This was doctrine. This was survival. The first hour ended. I had authorized 63 shipments. My ledger was filling with stamps and signatures, each one a small knot of responsibility. I moved to the next checkpoint, interior blessing chambers. These were smaller halls where tank compartments were sanctified before final assembly. Tech priests moved through each space with ritual precision, anointing surfaces with sacred oils, embedding purity seals into weld joints, reciting prayers that would bind machine spirits to their iron shells. I entered Chamber 7 and immediately noticed the crew compartments were sealed. Heavy armor plating had been welded over access hatches, and blessed rivets secured every seam. This was unusual. Doctrine specified that interiors should remain accessible until final assembly, allowing for last-minute adjustments and additional sanctification. I checked my schematic overlay. According to the design specifications, these compartments should still be open. Scribe. A voice behind me. I turned to find Enginseer Dominus Kale, the same adept who had conducted the initial assembly rite. His augmetic eye glowed softly in the chamber's dim light. "You appear confused." "The compartments," I said, gesturing toward the sealed hull. "They're closed earlier than specified." "A recent optimization," Kale replied. "Approved by the fabricator locum 3 cycles ago. We have found that early sealing improves structural integrity and reduces contamination risk. The machine spirits respond more favorably when their sanctuaries are protected from external interference." I consulted my data slate. No update notification. No revised schematic. I don't have documentation of this change. Kale's mechadendrites extended, one of them interfacing directly with my data slate. Data streamed across the screen: approval codes, revised liturgies, sanctification amendments. Everything appeared legitimate. "You have it now," he said. "Amend your notes accordingly." I hesitated. The chamber felt wrong. Not the architecture that was standard, blessed, correct, but the atmosphere. The air had a thickness to it, a humidity that did not belong in a forge environment. And beneath the incense, I detected something faintly biological. Sweat, perhaps, or breath. "Is something troubling you, scribe?" Kale's tone was patient, but his augmetic eye tracked my movements with mechanical precision. "No, Enginseer Dominus," I replied. "I will amend my notes." I typed the update into my ledger. Interior compartments sealed per revised optimization protocols. Sanctification confirmed. Authorization granted. The words appeared on the screen, solid and official. I applied my seal. The chamber's status changed from pending to approved. Kale nodded, satisfied, and departed. I stood alone among the sealed tanks, each one a silent iron shell waiting to be filled with purpose. The third hour brought me to the penal integration floor. This was not part of my standard rotation, but a servo skull had delivered a priority summons. My presence was required for a material compliance verification during a scheduled processing event. The message was terse, formal, and non-negotiable. I followed the skull through corridors that grew narrower and less adorned until we reached a reinforced blast door marked with crimson warning glyphs. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the chamber was clinical. White tiles, bright lumen strips, and the smell of disinfectant barely masking something richer, warmer. A dozen figures stood in a line, shackled at the wrists and ankles. They wore prison greys, and their heads were shaved. Some were weeping, others stared forward with empty eyes. Skitarii flanked them, weapons ready but not raised. At the far end of the chamber, a mechanized altar waited, not a forge altar, but something more intricate. Neural interfaces, bio-injection arrays, restraint harnesses suspended from overhead rails. A Munitorum prefect stood near the entrance, reviewing a data slate. She looked up as I approached. "Scribe 7743 Kappa, you're here to witness material integration compliance. These individuals have been condemned by regimental tribunal desertion, cowardice, dereliction. Their sentences have been commuted to final service. You will observe the rite and confirm that all procedures align with sanctioned protocols." What is final service?" I asked, though part of me already understood. "Repurposing," she said flatly. "The Imperium does not waste resources. Their bodies will contribute to the crusade effort. Their flesh will be rendered, their neural tissue preserved and integrated into vehicle control systems. They will serve the Emperor more faithfully in death than they did in life." I looked at the condemned. One of them, a young man with a half-healed scar across his jaw, met my eyes. He did not speak. He did not plead. He simply looked at me. And in that gaze, I saw recognition not of me, but of his own irrelevance. He knew. They all knew. This was not a surprise. This was procedure. A tech priest approached the first prisoner and began the rite. The words were liturgical, spoken in High Gothic and Lingua Technis, layered over each other until meaning dissolved into rhythm. The prisoner was led to the altar, secured in the harness, and the neural interface lowered onto his skull. I heard the click of engagement, saw his body stiffen, then relax as sedatives flooded his system. The machinery hummed. Biomonitors displayed vital signs transitioning into data streams. The tech priest continued chanting, and the forge hands responded in unison, their voices rising and falling in waves. The screaming began when the rendering started. It was not constant. It came in bursts, brief cries that were immediately smothered by the volume of the liturgy. The chant grew louder, more insistent, transforming pain into prayer. The machinery worked efficiently, separating components, preserving tissue, transferring neural matter into sterile containment vessels. The process took 11 minutes. At the end, what remained was unrecognizable, a collection of sorted resources, catalogued and prepared for integration. The next prisoner was brought forward. I watched all 12. I was required to. My role was to confirm that no heretical practices were employed, that all rites were performed correctly, that the condemned were processed according to approved doctrine. I signed the attestation form after each one. My hand was steady. I had been trained to witness difficult things. The Imperium's survival required hard choices. This was one of them. But when I left the chamber, I found myself in an empty corridor, and I vomited against the wall. My body rejected what my mind had accepted. I wiped my mouth, drank from my water ration, and continued my inspection route. The ledger did not record my nausea. It recorded only compliance. The 4th hour was supposed to be a respite. I returned to my verification station to process accumulated documentation and synchronize my data slate with the manufactory-wide network. But the respite did not come. Instead, a priority notification appeared: field test simulation required. Mandatory observation for all Munitorum personnel currently on shift. I joined 24 other scribes and administrators in a reinforced observation gallery overlooking a sealed testing chamber. The chamber was enormous, its floor scarred with blast marks and tread patterns from previous trials. At the center, a newly completed tank idled, a Lehman Russ variant, its hull freshly painted in the drab grey of Crusade standard camouflage. Purity seals covered every surface, and the Imperial Aquila gleamed on its forward armor. A tech priest's voice echoed through the Vox, initiating machine spirit activation sequence. All personnel maintain observation protocols. The tank's engine roared to life. It was loud, overwhelming, the sound of controlled violence. But beneath the mechanical thunder, I heard something else. Voices, faint, layered, synchronized. Not words, but vocalizations, rhythmic, obedient, almost musical. The tank moved forward, its treads grinding against the chamber floor. It executed a series of maneuvers, sharp turns, acceleration bursts, emergency stops. Each movement was precise, instantaneous, as if the tank anticipated its own commands. "Excellent response coherence," the tech priest announced. "Machine spirit integration successful. Vehicle approved for Crusade deployment." The voices did not stop. They continued, a quiet undertone beneath the engine's roar. I realized I was hearing them because the observation gallery's acoustics amplified specific frequencies. I realized they were not mechanical artifacts. They were organic, human, preserved and integrated, just as the prefect had explained. The Munitorum prefect appeared beside me, her expression unreadable. "You appear disturbed, scribe." "The voices," I said quietly. "Inside the tank." "Neural synchronization," she replied. "The integrated biocomponents respond to command stimuli. It improves reaction times significantly. The Crusade is faltering, scribe. Losses are unsustainable. We must optimize every resource. This is not cruelty, this is necessity." "They were people," I said, and immediately regretted it. Her eyes hardened. "They remain people. They serve the Emperor. What greater purpose exists?" I did not answer. She did not expect one. The tank completed its trial and was powered down. The voices faded. The chamber emptied. I returned to my station and continued my shift. The ledger recorded the test as successful. My seal authorized deployment. The hours accumulated. I moved through verification checkpoints like a servitor, executing tasks with mechanical precision. My body was present, but my thoughts had begun to fracture. I kept remembering the names from the initial assembly rite: Corvin, Melissa, Trant, Davos. Were they the voices I had heard? Were they the neural tissue processed in the penal integration chamber? The system did not distinguish. The system only demanded efficiency. At the 6th hour, I was assigned to the archive wing to reconcile discrepancies between current production reports and historical records. This was unusual. Archive work was typically reserved for senior scribes, but the assignment came with prefect-level authority, so I complied. The archive was located in a sealed section of the manufactory, accessible only through magnetically locked blast doors. I presented my credentials to the armed sentries, and they allowed me entry. The archive was silent. No Vox chants, no forge noise, no human voices, just rows of data stacks and cogitator terminals, each one humming softly in the recycled air. I found my assigned terminal and began the reconciliation task. Production reports from the last 6 months appeared on the screen. I cross-referenced them with historical averages, flagged inconsistencies, and prepared corrective documentation. But as I worked, I began to notice patterns. The current production cycle was not unique. Identical processes had been recorded for decades. The same euphemisms appeared across multiple forge worlds: biological surplus, neural integration, material reclamation. The efficiency gains were consistent. The casualty replacement ratios normalized over time. This was not an emergency measure. This was standard practice. I opened older files going back 10 years, 20, 50. The methodology remained unchanged. The language evolved slightly, terminology updated, rites refined, but the core process persisted. The Imperium had been doing this for generations, longer, perhaps. The tanks had always been built this way. The difference was that now I knew. I sat alone in the archive, surrounded by evidence, and felt something inside me collapse. Not faith. Faith was deeper, more resilient, but certainty. I had believed that Imperial doctrine was harsh but necessary, brutal but righteous. I had believed that sacrifice was voluntary, that service was honored, that humanity's survival depended on its willingness to give everything for the Emperor's vision. But this was different. This was systematic erasure. This was humanity repurposed into machinery, consciousness preserved only as reflex, identity reduced to data. The Imperium did not merely demand sacrifice, it recycled the faithful into tools, then pretended this was mercy. The realization did not arrive as shock, it arrived as weight, a pressure that settled across my shoulders and refused to lift. I saved my reconciliation report, logged out of the terminal, and left the archive. The sentries did not question me. My credentials remained valid. I was still authorized. The system trusted me because I had not yet refused to comply. The 7th hour brought physical collapse. My legs trembled as I walked, my vision blurred at the edges. I had not eaten since the shift began. I had not rested. The manufactory's atmosphere, thick with heat and chemical residue, was wearing through my respiratory filters. I stopped in a designated rest alcove, drank water, and tried to steady my breathing. A servo skull approached, its optics glowing red. It hovered at eye level and projected a message across my vision. Scribe 7,743 kappa. Performance metrics indicate declining efficiency. Medical intervention available upon request. Acknowledge. I acknowledged. The skull departed. No intervention came. The message was not an offer, it was a warning. Decline further and I would be flagged for corrective action. Servitorization was not reserved for the condemned. It was also applied to those who proved insufficiently resilient. I forced myself upright and continued my route. The 8th hour, the 9th, the 10th, time lost meaning. The manufactory became a loop of identical chambers, identical rites, identical seals applied to identical ledgers. My hand moved automatically. My voice recited confirmations without thought. I was functioning, but I was no longer present. During the 11th hour, I witnessed the final assembly of the shift's last vehicle. It was brought to the consecration platform, surrounded by tech priests and forge hands, and subjected to the ultimate blessing. The Engincia Dominus spoke the litany of eternal vigilance, anointing the hull with sacred oils while servitors inscribed final purity seals. The tank's engine idled, a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the chamber itself. And then I heard them again, the voices, clearer now because the chamber was quieter. They were not screaming, they were not weeping, they were harmonizing. A choir of the dead, synchronized perfectly, responding to every command with obedient precision. The Imperium's perfect soldiers, unquestioning, uncomplaining, eternal. The blessing concluded. The tank was sealed and moved to the loading bay. I signed the final authorization. 417 vehicles completed. The shift was over. I returned to the verification station to submit my ledger. A Munitorum prefect was waiting for me, not the one from the penal chamber, but someone higher. Prefect General Orion, identifiable by the gold trim on her uniform and the authority rosette pinned to her chest. She did not greet me. She simply gestured toward a private conference chamber. I followed. Inside, the chamber was small and soundproofed. A single table, 2 chairs, a data terminal embedded in the wall. Orion sat and indicated I should do the same. I obeyed. My legs were grateful for the rest, even as my mind prepared for judgment. Scribe 7,743 kappa, she began, her voice calm and measured. Your work this shift has been reviewed. Your seals are accurate. Your documentation is thorough. However, your biometric readings indicate significant psychological strain. Your hesitation intervals have increased by 43% over the last 6 hours. Your verbal confirmations contain micropauses suggesting cognitive dissonance. These metrics are concerning. I said nothing. She continued. You have been exposed to operational processes that are, by necessity, shielded from general personnel. This exposure was required due to staffing shortages. However, your response profile suggests that continued assignment to verification duties may compromise your effectiveness. Do you understand what I am saying? Yes, Prefect General, I replied. My voice was steady but hollow. The Imperium values your service, she said, and the gentleness in her tone was worse than any accusation. You have performed your duties with diligence, but sometimes faithful servants are burdened with knowledge that exceeds their capacity for integration. This is not a failure of character. It is a limitation of human psychology. She activated the data terminal. A document appeared, a reassignment order, pre-approved, awaiting only my acknowledgement. You have 3 options, Orion said. First, immediate termination, recorded as martyrdom in service to the Munitorum. Your name will be added to the honor rolls. Second, voluntary servitorization with memory reduction protocols. You will continue serving the Imperium in a capacity suited to your capabilities. Third, continuation of current duties with mandatory psychological conditioning. This option carries the highest risk of permanent cognitive damage. I stared at the document. 3 choices, all of them erasure. My voice cracked. I swallowed and tried again. I choose service. Orion nodded, unsurprised. Specify. Second option, I whispered. Servitorization. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The gesture was almost kind. You will be remembered. Your sacrifice will be honored. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The words were automatic, a reflex ingrained since childhood. I repeated them. The Emperor protects. Orion stood and activated a Vox link. Within minutes, Medicae servitors arrived with a gurney. I did not resist as they transferred me onto it. Restraints were unnecessary. I was compliant. I had always been compliant. That was the problem and the solution. The ceiling lights passed overhead as they wheeled me through the corridors. I recognized the route. We were returning to the penal integration chamber. The irony was not lost on me, but I felt no bitterness. Only exhaustion. Only the quiet relief of a decision made. The chamber was empty now, scrubbed clean. The altar waited, its neural interfaces gleaming under sterile lumen strips. The tech priest from before the one who had processed the condemned approached with the same calm efficiency. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain the procedure. He simply began. This will not hurt, he said, though I had not asked. Your consciousness will be preserved in fragments. You will serve. You will obey. You will never doubt again. The harness lowered onto my shoulders. The neural interface touched my skull with cold precision. I felt the click of engagement, felt sedatives flood my veins, felt my body relax into inevitability. The last thing I heard was chanting, liturgy transforming fear into function. The voices of the faithful, singing me into silence. The last thing I thought was a question I would never answer. If we are all repurposed, who remains to remember what we were? Then the question dissolved, and I dissolved with it. I am component K7743. I serve aboard battle tank 417 Sigma, assigned to Crusade Fleet Hadran. My function is navigation response optimization. When the commander issues direction commands, I translate them into tread adjustments. I do this perfectly. I have never failed. I do not remember being trained for this role. I do not remember volunteering. I simply know my purpose, and I fulfill it. The tank moves forward. The engine roars. I am part of that roar. I am integrated, synchronized, essential. I do not think. I respond. I do not question. I obey. The crusade continues. We roll across ash plains and shattered cities. We break enemy lines and scatter Xenos filth. We are the Emperor's wrath made manifest. I am proud to serve. Sometimes, in the moments between commands, I feel something, a flicker, a fragment, a word trying to form. It never completes. The system is too efficient. The integration too thorough. Whatever I might have been is gone, rendered into pure function. This is mercy. This is righteousness. This is the only future the Imperium allows. The enemy appears on the horizon. The commander shouts orders. I translate them into motion. The tank surges forward, treads grinding, weapons primed. We are glorious. We are inevitable. I am no longer human. I am better than human. I am purpose without doubt, service without end. The Emperor protects. I repeat this silently, endlessly, the only prayer I remember. The Emperor protects. And somewhere, in a sealed archive on a distant forge world, a ledger records my name one final time before it is archived and forgotten. Scribe 7743 Kappa. Status reassigned. Service ongoing. The system endures. The war continues. The tanks roll on, humming faintly with the voices of those who no longer exist.